Hi, I'm Carson Carrico, and I'm here with my guest.
Zoe Deverly.
We're going to be talking about sibling psychology through the mediums of Thor and Loki today.
Two very interesting fellows, right, Cece?
I agree. I know that in the Marvel movies, Loki's portrayed as this evil god of mischief. How is he portrayed in Norse mythology?
Well, actually, in Norse mythology, he was a lot more about balance and change. He wasn't necessarily evil. He was just somebody with characteristics that people didn't normally like, and he was also very different from what had been considered the Norse stereotype. This very tall, blonde, strong warrior Viking, which is what we see in Thor. And a lot of the reason they have such a close relationship because they're such complete opposites, and they really balance each other out, and that plays a lot into their sibling rivalry that we see within the Marvel universe.
I would agree, and I know that they aren't related. Are they related in the Marvel movies? Are they related in by blood in Norse mythology?
Actually, no. In the Marvel universe, of course, they have the Loki's adopted. He's actually a frost giant, and that isn't true.
Even though Thor and Loki are not related, I they have this kind of sibling bond, and this bond is very typical to form between even two friends, and people can form these very close relationships even though they are not of blood, the same blood. And I feel like with those close relationships, we get into this kind of zone of friendship where even though we Thor and Loki aren't blood related, that they can still bond with each other. And I feel like that's very common. I do have siblings, and I can attest that we all love each other very much, and we would agree that outside of the home we would also be friends.
I definitely agree with that. I am, an only child, but I don't feel that I lack any, emotional bonds that you would like what you would have with a sibling. I get those bonds fulfilled by different people, close friends, my mother's aunts, uncles, that sort of thing. So I definitely think that you can be brothers and sisters in emotions and not by blood.
I agree. I think that um, that this portrayal of Thor and Loki gives these gods who are, in a sense, supposed to be above humanity as a whole. I think it brings them down to kind of like a human level because it's going with their kind of like primal relational instincts.
I would definitely agree with that. The Norse gods are a lot more human-like than even the Greek gods. Um, they weren't really godly and how we would think of it. They weren't these omnipotent, constantly watching all the people in the world. I think to the Norse gods, people were kind of just like, collateral damage. We were just sort of there and they were doing their cool Norse, Asera things. So
Even though the Norse gods are separated from the human realm, they still possess kind of these human qualities. And we can see that in Thor and Loki's relationship because in some ways they relate to siblings in the human realm in general. They kind of closely relate to my siblings, and we play tricks on each other. We have gotten in very aggressive fights.
hopefully you haven't tried to kill any of your siblings.
Not recently.
Oh, okay.
Um, Also on that with how they relate to humans, there is this kind of argument that humans have called the nature versus nurture argument, saying that nature is kind of it's the environment and what's around you and how that affects you,
Mm-hmm.
and there's nurture, who takes care of you and what's in your blood.
And as far as the whole idea of nature versus nurture, I think a Loki is a really good representation of how both affect a person. Um, I mean, obviously, his nature is he's a trickster. That's just sort of how he is. He's one of the. I envision him if I knew modern Loki, just saw him walking down the street. I envision him as being someone who's very sarcastic and witty. Uh, so he's just that is how his nature is. And certainly his frost giants, the fact that he's a frost giant plays into that. I mean, the most they're not the people that the Norse really liked. But on the other hand, I do think nurture had a lot to do, especially in the Marvel universe, with how Loki turns out. I think Loki feels a lot of resentment towards his father. That can especially be seen in the more recent Thor movies that have come out. I think he feels, sort of second class and that he's been pushed aside for Thor. And I think that is a large part of why we see Loki becoming so evil in, movies like The Avengers, is his daddy issues, to put it in a nutshell.
Going off that, sibling competition can also be leading up to that because through my research, I have found that sibling relationships are very primal. If let's say in this case Thor, he was kind of put on a pedestal, kind of
Mm-hmm.
like for his fighting ability, and that he was going to get the throne of Asgard. So, but with Loki, he's kind of like underclass, so he's trying to overcompensate in ways, and he's trying to get the throne for himself, and doing that in any possible way to go to Odin and find a way to be under to overcome the second class
Mm-hmm.
nature's box he's been put in.
And that's definitely an invention of the Marvel universe, is this idea that Thor is in every way superior and Loki has to prove himself. But I definitely agree with the sentiment that there's a lot of competition rivalry, and I would definitely say that a lot more of it is on Loki's end than on Thor's. But to that being said, Thor is obviously the dominant, dominant brother. He gives him an advantage. And like we said before, he's very stereotypical Viking. He's what they valued within a man. He was big and strong and tall and a warrior, and he was a ladies' man. Um, so that's definitely, I definitely think there's that rivalry that Loki feels that he does not fit in and therefore has to compete with Thor. But on the other hand, in a more Norse, ancient view, I definitely think that they kind of balance each other out. And though Thor was much more stereotypically what you would think of, Loki also had his benefits, and the Norse people saw that and understood that they weren't competitors. They were two people who worked together in different ways to achieve the same end goal.
I can agree that. Now, I know you studied Loki in Norse mythology terms,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to know kind of what his philosophy is, what he brings to humanity.
So I think Loki represents the not so pleasant parts of a person in humanity, which is why he takes on this role as somebody who is evil. He's really encompasses balance. He balances out these more godly gods that we have, the Odins and the Thors, with this much more down to earth realism. He represents change. No matter Loki touches a lot of things. He kind of has his fingers in lots of pies. Is sort of involved in lots of different things, and whatever he touches doesn't stay the same. He changes things, be it for the better or for the worse. He brings around change. He causes the Ragnarok, which is the end of the Norse gods. They all kind of die, and he does bring that around, which most people will be like, "Goodness, how evil of him! He kills all these people." But I truly believe that the North saw this much more as just sort of like a rolling over. Things were changing because that's what happens. Gods are born, they rule for a couple millennia, and then they kind of die off, and the next round of gods come on. So he changes things, and he also represents being different and sort of being the underdog in this fluidity. Loki really is his own man or woman or giant or whatever he wants to be. He gives birth a couple times, has lots of different children. So he really represents just being yourself. So he's a very complex god, and he also represents the complexity of the Norse people.
And off of that, you said that he kind of represents the kind of like other sides of humanity that you don't necessarily see in a positive light. How much do you know about psychopathy?
Not a ton. I mean, I'm not a psychologist. If I had to, just go off the psychopaths that I've heard about, Hannibal Lecter's, type, I definitely feel, especially in the Marvel universe, that he has mental issues of some sort. I'm not, qualified to diagnose that, but I definitely see the characteristics.
There is no category of psychopathy. It was narrowed down to a couple of traits in the DSM-4, which is kind of this book that has a bunch of mental illnesses, and it spiked from the third one. It was increased by over like 300 new different disorders. So it's getting bigger constantly, and they kind of have this list that has the traits of what a psychopath is, and psychopathy manifests itself into society a lot more than you would normally think it does, because our CEOs have numerous psychopathic traits. Like a trait of being a psychopath is kind of self narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
It's how you feel about yourself and how you talk about yourself. Another trait is kind of this feeling like if you see something gory, you're not going to have any reaction with it. And I think in ways that people kind of like shun psychopaths, kind of, it manifests itself a whole lot more. Another trait off the top of my head is this kind of mirror or camouflage effect. Like if you don't feel emotions as well, so if you see someone else being emotional, you're going to kind of copy their emotions to get the same effect. It's kind of like this overpowering sense of manipulation, which I think Loki has kind of mastered.
Very manipulative, yes.
And so, though I don't think he is a full-fledged psychopath, I think that he incorporates some of the traits very easily. Would you attest to that?
I would definitely agree that that's sort of included into the whole parts of humanity that we don't really love to talk about. I definitely think he is, I don't even know if I would say manipulative, but very, very charismatic. He is a ladies' man. He talks to lots of women, sleeps with lots of women. He has lots of friends and several enemies. But I definitely think he is repeatedly called cunning and quick of tongue. So I definitely think he is charismatic in that way. As far as narcissism goes, I've never really read anything specifically calling Loki a narcissist, but from everything I've read about him, both in the Marvel Universe and the Marvel movies, and the books I've read about ancient Loki, I think that Loki likes Loki a lot. He's one of the few gods that the Norse specifically say is very handsome. I would like to think that he thought of himself very highly. And in the Marvel universe, he's very dramatic and self-centered. He makes very dramatic entrances. The clothes he chooses to wear are a lot more Norsey, almost than even Thor's, with the big horns and the gold and the green. I definitely think he likes to make an entrance, and he likes for it to be about him. And I think he thinks quite highly of himself. We see this, and he's so shocked when he gets beaten in the Avengers, and I think that's very representative of him in the Marvel universe.
Going off of that, though I don't think he is a full psychopath, I think he does have impulse control disorder, which is this disorder where you're very emotionally grounded, and so when, let's say, something doesn't go your way, you're going to react and in worst case scenarios black out and just commit these horrible actions. Like an example would be a kid losing a card game and then going and throwing anything closest to him.
I don't know if I agree that Loki is impulsive. I, in my mind, think of him as much more of a cold, calculated type killer. I think of him as somebody who I think he has impulses, and I think, especially in the Marvel universe, he's kind of quick to anger. But I also think he's very thoughtful and deliberate in the way he does things. I don't think he's the Thor type. To me, Thor is very much like, oh, you dishonored my family, well, let me hit you with Mjolnir. I don't think Loki is like that. I think he's very much more cold and calculating. That being said, I'm sure he'll stick a sword in you just as much as the next person would, but I think he thinks about it a lot more. And we see this in, the sort of well thought out takeover of Earth and, say the Avengers, that he thinks about it a little bit. He also gets himself in plenty of bad situations, though, so I can definitely see him, especially in Norse mythology, getting into situations from impulse that he then has to get himself out of. He takes lots of bets in Norse mythology, kind of the god of betting, and sometimes that turns out really well for him, and sometimes it does not, and that's a very impulsive trait to me.
Going off of that, back into the sibling competition range, he kind of I feel like he had time to plan whatever he was going to do in the Marvel franchise. I feel like he had taken all of his anger, and I feel like the entire whole thing was kind of very impulsive. Like the idea itself was impulsive, but he still kind of spent time calculating it.
I think this kind of goes off the whole, the idea that he has some sort of mental illness, that he has a very elaborate plan, but it's based on something that is so removed from reality that it in itself becomes removed from reality. So I definitely understand that it was something that, while not done impulsively, stemmed from an impulse.
And in sibling psychology, there's this kind of air around the middle and younger children that they are not going to succeed as well as the older. And though this air is actually statistically true, the older children are more likely to go to college. They're also most of our congressmen and women and CEOs are older children, and the reasoning behind that is kind of that they're the first child. They're the first thing the parents have created or the parents have adopted, and they're going to manifest more of their time in, and they kind of build them up on this pedestal. And I feel like Thor was especially in the Marvel franchise, was put on this pedestal. And I feel that Loki is kind of feeling the brunt of that, kind of feeling like he's a bother or he won't be able to put himself on this pedestal.
I definitely agree that Loki is a victim of, second born disorder. That he feels lesser because of that. But I also think a large part of that is due to the monarchical system that we see, especially in the Marvel universe. The idea that the monarch, who we see as Odin, is going to pass on his throne to his firstborn. I definitely see that as being a large part of their sibling rivalry. That when Odin dies, Thor is potentially going to take over the throne. As far as it's debatable as to whether Thor is really ready to take on the throne. I wouldn't argue that Thor is more intelligent or more mature than Loki, but he is probably the one that's going to become king, and I think that's where that second child syndrome. And I think that's why Loki is partially so bitter about it, especially in Marvel. Well, mostly in Marvel. Of course, they're not really brothers, and there's not really monarchy going on in the ancient Norse. But it's because he feels more qualified than Thor to be king. He thinks of himself as much more intelligent, which goes back to the whole narcissism. So I do think that there is competition, and that he feels that he is a victim of being the second child.
And I feel like in the family aspect that Odin doesn't really try to include Loki because he know where he comes from, and the Frost Giants are kind of like mortal enemies to the people of Asgard. I do feel like his wife Freya, she's more like a mother figure, so it kind of hurts Loki when stuff happens to her.
I don't know if I have enough information to fully, say that you're right, but that is also the feeling I get. Of course, in ancient Norse mythology, as the Norse knew it, Odin was probably closer with Loki than he was with Thor. Especially, I've read from a very Loki-centric point of view, but this is what I've discovered, that they were quite close and quite similar. And I really haven't done much research into Freya. But from the Marvel Universe, I definitely would agree that they try to paint the picture of Loki being neglected almost by his father, that he is second class, and try to really create this idea of Thor being the golden child. And I think that's just as large of a part of Thor's character as it is of Loki's. That they really want to make him the golden boy. And Odin sees him like that. And I think Freya is painted to be with somebody, I have very little experience with her, but somebody who's very loving and open. So I definitely think she was much more of Loki's rock. And I think that's why he was so upset when, she got killed. And, of course, this is all based solely upon the Marvel movies, and it has very little basis in actual Norse mythology.
I feel like Thor and Loki are a part of an elastic concept as well with their relationship, even though surrounding their family, as before Thor went to Earth in the Marvel movies, their relationship was much different as it was when they both were exposed to how Earth works and how it is when you attempt to conquer it. I feel like that elastic concept, which is the concept that when things change, the siblings change with it, I feel like that has proven true.
I mean, how could you trust your brother after he basically, gets you pretty much exiled, and then tries to steal your throne and, hurt your father and all that horrible things? I mean, I definitely think that how could that not change a relationship, especially between two siblings? I mean, that would change a relationship between anybody, even if you don't really have a relationship with that person. Trying to do horrible things like that would definitely, I mean, you can't trust that person anymore. And I definitely think that is what happens. Thor can just simply not trust Loki anymore. I mean, he has proven himself to be untrustworthy and to be manipulative. Um, so that, I definitely think that is a very, big change in their relationship. And then, of course, when in the Avengers, when it really becomes bad, I think that relationship is almost gone at that point. I think Thor still feels for Loki, and maybe even still loves him, but I don't. I don't think I could repair that relationship. If that had happened to me and my brother had tried to destroy the world, a realm which I feel very strongly about, and kill millions upon millions of people, I think that's very damaging for any relationship.
And I do think in the Dark World, though, they do still kind of like repair some of it, though the initial damage is still done.
I would agree with that. I think as we sort of see their relationship progress throughout all the movies they're in. In Thor, they start out with this very brotherly relationship, and they're actually seen like friends. And then we have the Avengers, which is not a good time for the Thor Loki relationship. And then we see sort of in the Dark World that they've semi-repaired it, but not really. I think it becomes much less brotherly and emotional, and much more about, I need you to do this so I can do this. It's much more cordial, that they need each other. Loki needs Thor to get out of jail, and Thor needs Loki to help him. So it's sort of, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine, versus I truly have an emotional connection with you.
Oh, I see that. In words of altruism, which is the willingness to act unselfishly toward another person, I feel like, though it's not really considered a humane quality, I feel like humans have been in a pattern where they're more likely to choose money over helping someone else. And I feel like Loki may represent that in both Norse and the Marvel movies.
Loki is not an altruist. He's not. He doesn't do thing entirely, for the benefit of other people, as we might see, like the Christian God, how he's very much somebody who, or Jesus, who sacrifices themselves truly for the benefit of others. Loki's not like that, but neither are any of the Norse gods. Thor isn't like that. Odin isn't like that. None of these gods are people who sacrifice purely for the betterment of humanity or for the betterment of others. I mean, I think they're all in the game for themselves, because they're very much representations of humans, and we're all in the game for ourselves. Basic survival instinct. They're not necessarily inherently better than all of us. They're just stronger. So he's not altruistic, but none of them are. So I don't think that's a specifically Loki issue.
Okay. Sibling psychologist Bedford says that conflicts with siblings give you growth experience you wouldn't have outside the family. You get to push limits further than you usually would with other relationships. Do you think that's kind of true, especially in the Dark World, when they try to repair things to an extent?
Well, if I can just interject from a personal standpoint, I'm not sure that I feel like I get everything I need from siblings from other people, that I'm not necessarily lacking because I don't have a sibling. At the same time, would Loki have ever tried to take over, Asgard in the Marvel Universe if there had been no Thor? Probably not. So from that standpoint, I think you could argue that yes, they're both very different people because of it. And I think we see in the Marvel Universe a very large shift in Thor. We mostly focus on Loki, but I think Loki causes a shift in Thor, because I think it really hurts Thor and makes him much more worldly when he sees what Loki does. And that he sees that he's losing that relationship, and he sees that he's basically losing who his brother was. This little boy that he grew up with is now somebody who, resents him and wants to kill him. So I definitely think that has an effect on him. As far as, their childhood together and that sort of thing, I can't really attest that they don't talk about that anywhere in ancient Norse mythology. And we get very few snapshots of that in Marvel movies. There might be more Marvel comics, but I really haven't researched those extensively.
Okay. And I feel like that concludes, we've hit the point of how Loki has been affected by both nature and nurture, and we have also hit how Thor and Loki relate to humans, and how Loki and psychopathy and as well as impulse control disorder relate. I feel like we really hit all aspects of the gods in general.
Yeah, and I'm really glad we get this opportunity because I do think they have a very interesting relationship, and they're two very unique and special gods, especially Loki. And I think he kind of gets a bad rap, that he's evil and, crazy and power hungry. And in the Marvel Universe, he is all those things, but he's not just those things. He's also a brother and a son, and as human as you can be and be a Norse god.
And I think that's why that this topic for an IB project was hard, because there are so many aspects to Loki, whether it's his sibling side or whether it's his mental orientation or even just how he's portrayed. There's just so many layers, like an onion.
I would definitely agree with that. I've also been doing a project on Loki, a kind of a different aspect, and he's just incredibly complex, and he reflects how incredibly complex the Norse people were. And I also think it's very difficult to say that Loki is like this or Loki is like that because there are so many different Lokis. You have the Marvel movie Loki, which we spent a long time talking about today, and you have actual Loki from, the original Norse mythology where he first shows up, and you have comic Loki, and comic Loki has is subdivided into, there was a time period where Loki was a woman in the comics, and there was a time period where he was a child in the comics. There've been costume changes and relationship changes, and he changes personality with each one, so it's very difficult to dig out who true Loki is and all those different representations of him. But I think we've done a pretty good job.
Thank you, and if you would like us to analyze more superheroes and supervillains, please leave a like. Thank you for listening.